this very moment, you are aware of reading these words. You're experiencing the visual sensation of text on a screen or page, perhaps hearing an internal voice narrating the words, maybe feeling the weight of a device in your hands or the surface beneath you. You have thoughts about what you're reading, feelings about whether you're interested or tired, memories of other things you've read, anticipations of what might come next. All of this is happening in your subjective experience, in the private theater of your mind that no one else can access directly. But what is this awareness? What is this inner experience that seems so immediate and undeniable, yet is so profoundly difficult to explain or even define? This is the mystery of consciousness, perhaps the deepest and most perplexing question that humans have ever confronted. It's the most familiar thing in existence, the one thing you can be absolutely certain of, the foundation of everything you know and experience. And yet, it's also the most baffling, the most resistant to explanation, the phenomenon that has stumped philosophers for millennia and continues to divide scientists and theorists today. Welcome to this exploration of consciousness, this journey into the most intimate mystery of human existence. Over the next several hours, we'll examine this question from every angle available to us. Philosophical arguments about the nature of subjective experience, neuroscientific investigations into the brain's role, debates about whether machines could ever be conscious, explorations of altered states and unusual forms of awareness, and ultimately the question of whether consciousness is something we'll ever fully understand or whether it might remain forever mysterious. This is designed as both a deep intellectual inquiry and a companion for sleep. So if you find yourself drifting away, that's perfectly appropriate. There's a certain irony in falling asleep during a discussion of consciousness, in losing the very thing we're talking about. But that irony is welcome here. Let the ideas wash over you, and when sleep comes, embrace it. The mystery of consciousness will still be here in the morning, unsolved, waiting. Before we can explore consciousness, we need to attempt something nearly impossible: defining what we're talking about. This is harder than it might seem. Consciousness is the most immediate thing in your experience, the thing you know most directly, and yet when you try to put it into words, it becomes slippery and elusive. Philosophers and scientists have struggled with this for centuries, and there's still no consensus on a precise definition. But we can start with what's become perhaps the most influential approach to defining consciousness, one proposed by the philosopher Thomas Nagel in his famous 1974 paper, "What is it like to be a bat?" Nagel suggested that an organism is conscious if, and only if, there is something that it's like to be that organism, some subjective character to its experience. This might sound circular or vague, but it actually captures something crucial about consciousness. When you see the color red, there's something it's like to see red, a qualitative character to that experience that's different from seeing blue or green. When you taste chocolate, there's something it's like to taste chocolate, a subjective quality that's distinct from tasting vanilla or coffee. When you feel pain, there's something it's like to feel pain that's fundamentally different from the physical damage occurring in your body. These subjective qualities, these what it's like aspects of experience, are what philosophers call qualia, and and they're central to what we mean by consciousness. This definition immediately reveals why consciousness is so puzzling. When scientists study vision, they can trace the path of light entering the eye, the conversion of photons into electrical signals in the retina, the processing of these signals through various brain regions, the identification of edges and colors and objects. They can explain all of this in physical terms, describing neural firing patterns and computational processes. But none of this explanation seems to capture the redness of red, the subjective experience of seeing red. There's an explanatory gap between the objective, third-person description of what the brain is doing and the subjective, first-person experience of what it's like. This gap is what makes consciousness such a unique problem in science and philosophy. Every other aspect of the natural world seems amenable to objective study and explanation. But consciousness, by its very nature, has this irreducibly subjective character that seems to resist objective analysis. Philosophers distinguish between different aspects or types of consciousness, and understanding these distinctions helps clarify what we're investigating. Phenomenal consciousness refers to the subjective, experiential aspects we've been discussing. The qualia, the what it's like character of experience. Access consciousness refers to information being available for use in reasoning, verbal report, and control of behavior. You can be phenomenally conscious of something without being able to report it or use it cognitively, as in some cases of blind sight that we'll discuss later. And you can have information cognitively available without any particular subjective experience of it, as when you automatically process visual information while your attention is elsewhere. Self-consciousness is yet another aspect, the ability to be aware of yourself as a distinct entity, to reflect on your own mental states, to have thoughts about your thoughts. Not all consciousness requires self-consciousness. A dog or an infant may be phenomenally conscious, experiencing pain or pleasure, without having the sophisticated self-reflective awareness that humans develop. Another crucial distinction is between creature consciousness and state consciousness. A creature is conscious when it's awake and aware rather than asleep or comatose or dead. But within that waking state, you can be conscious of some things and not others. Right now you're conscious of these words, but you probably weren't conscious of the pressure of your clothes against your skin until I mentioned it. And now suddenly you are. The content of consciousness is constantly shifting as attention moves, as some information becomes accessible, while other information fades into the background. This selectivity of consciousness, the fact that you can only be conscious of a small fraction of the information your brain is processing at any given moment, is one of the aspects that neuroscientists study extensively. Understanding what determines which information reaches consciousness and which remains unconscious could provide crucial insights into the nature of consciousness itself. The contemporary philosophical debate about consciousness often centers on what the philosopher David Chalmers has called the hard problem of consciousness. Chalmers, in a famous 1995 paper, distinguished between the easy problems and the hard problem. The so-called easy problems, though they're far from trivial scientifically, are questions about cognitive and behavioral functions that we can imagine answering through standard scientific methods. How does the brain integrate information from different sensory modalities? How does it distinguish between self and other? How does attention work to select some information for processing while filtering out other information? How does the brain control behavior based on sensory input? These are all difficult questions requiring sophisticated neuroscience, but they're the kind of questions we know in principle how to approach. We can study neural mechanisms, identify brain regions involved, trace information, processing pathways, build computational models. Even if we don't have complete answers yet, we understand what kind of answers we're looking for and how to go about finding them. But the hard problem is different in kind, not just in degree of difficulty. The hard problem is, why is there subjective experience at all? Why doesn't all this information processing happen in the dark, so to speak, without any inner experience accompanying it? Why is there something it's like to be you, to see red, to feel pain, to taste chocolate? You could imagine, at least in principle, a creature that processes information about the world exactly the way your brain does, that responds to stimuli in exactly the same ways you do, that says all the same things you say about its experiences, but for which there's no subjective experience, no inner life, nothing it's like to be that creature. Philosophers call this hypothetical entity a philosophical zombie, and the question is, what's the difference between you and the zombie? What is it about your brain that produces consciousness when, theoretically, all the same functions could be performed without consciousness? This thought experiment is controversial. Some philosophers argue that philosophical zombies are incoherent, that if something processes information and responds to the world exactly as a conscious being does, then it is conscious by definition, that there can't be this additional fact of subjective experience that could be present or absent while everything else remains the same. But other philosophers insist that zombies are at least conceivable, that we can imagine all the physical facts being the same, while consciousness is absent. And if we can conceive of this, it suggests that consciousness is something over and above the physical processes, something that requires explanation beyond just describing brain function. This is the hard problem, explaining why and how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience, to the feeling of what it's like. Another thought experiment that illuminates the hard problem is Mary's room, proposed by the philosopher Frank Jackson. Imagine Mary, a brilliant scientist who knows absolutely everything there is to know about the physical and functional properties of color vision. She knows about wavelengths of light, about cone cells in the retina, about neural pathways in the visual system, about every physical fact relevant to color perception. But Mary has lived her entire life in a black and white room, seeing only through a black and white monitor. She's never actually seen colors. One day, Mary leaves the room and sees a ripe tomato for the first time. She experiences the redness of red. The question is, does Mary learn something new? It seems intuitively obvious that she does. She learns what it's like to see red. She gains the subjective experience that all her physical knowledge couldn't capture. But if she learns something new, then there must be facts about consciousness, facts about subjective experience that aren't captured by complete physical knowledge. This suggests that consciousness involves something beyond the physical, or at least something that can't be captured by objective physical descriptions. These thought experiments don't prove anything definitively. They're tools for clarifying our intuitions and testing different theories, but they illustrate why consciousness poses such a unique challenge. In every other domain of science, we assume that if we can explain how something works mechanically, how the parts interact to produce the observable behavior. We've explained the phenomenon. But with consciousness, even a complete mechanical explanation of how the brain works, even if we could trace every neural pathway and describe every computational process, seems to leave something out. The subjective experience itself. The what it's like. This is the explanatory gap, and it's what makes consciousness philosophically and scientifically perplexing in a way that nothing else is. To further illuminate what makes consciousness so strange and difficult to grasp, let's return to Thomas Nagel's bat. Nagel chose bats deliberately because they're mammals, relatively closely related to us, but their primary sensory mode, echolocation, is completely alien to human experience. Bats navigate and hunt by emitting high-frequency sounds and detecting the echoes that bounce back from objects. They can distinguish the size, shape, texture, distance, and even material composition of objects through sound. For a bat, echolocation isn't like our occasional use of echoes to estimate room size. It's their primary way of experiencing the world, as central to their experience as vision is to ours. Now, Nagel asks, what is it like to be a bat? What is the subjective character of echolocation experience? We can describe the mechanism of echolocation in complete physical detail. We can understand that sound waves travel through air, reflect off objects, and return to the bat's ears, where they're processed by the brain. We can even identify the specific neural structures involved and describe their function. But none of this tells us what it's like subjectively to experience the world through echolocation. We can try to imagine it. Perhaps it's something like seeing, where objects appear in a kind of spatial field. Or perhaps it's more like a rapid succession of tactile sensations, as if the sound echoes are touching objects and reporting back. Or perhaps it's entirely unlike anything in our experience, a mode of awareness we simply can't conceive because we lack the sensory apparatus and the neural structures that would make that kind of experience possible. Nagel's point is that there's a limit to how much we can understand about another creature's consciousness through imagination and analogy. The subjective character of bat experience is fundamentally different from human experience, and we may simply be unable to know what it's like. This has profound implications. If we can't fully understand the consciousness of a bat, a mammal sharing significant neural architecture with us, what hope do we have of understanding the consciousness of more distantly related creatures like octopuses, with their radically different nervous systems, or insects, with their tiny brains, or potential artificial intelligences with silicon substrates instead of biological neurons? The problem of other minds, the question of how we can know whether other entities are conscious and what their experience is like, is thrown into sharp relief. We directly know only our own consciousness. Everything else is inference, based on behavior, on structural similarity, on our theories about what produces consciousness. But we can never directly access another being's subjective experience. You can never know what it's like to be me, and I can never know what it's like to be you. We're each trapped in our own subjectivity, able to describe it and discuss it, but never able to directly share it. Nagel also makes another crucial point. Consciousness is not reducible to physical processes in the way that other phenomena are. When we explain heat in terms of molecular motion, or lightning in terms of electrical discharge, The reduction works because both the thing being explained and the explanation are objective, third-person phenomena. We reduce one objective process to another, more fundamental objective process. But consciousness is inherently subjective, first person. Reducing it to objective third-person processes like neural firing patterns seems to eliminate the very thing we're trying to explain. The subjectivity disappears in the reduction. This is why Nagel argues that a full understanding of consciousness might require a new kind of theory, one that can bridge the gap between objective physical processes and subjective experience. Though he's skeptical, such a theory is possible with our current conceptual resources. While philosophers grapple with these conceptual puzzles, neuroscientists approach consciousness from a different angle. What is happening in the brain when we're conscious, and what distinguishes conscious from unconscious processes? This line of research looks for neural correlates of consciousness, or NCCs, the minimal neural mechanisms jointly sufficient for any one specific conscious experience. If you're consciously seeing a red circle, what is the minimum neural activity necessary and sufficient for that particular conscious experience? Finding NCCs doesn't solve the hard problem, doesn't explain why these neural processes are accompanied by subjective experience, but it does give us important information about the physical basis of consciousness and potentially helps us understand what types of systems can be conscious. One of the most basic findings is that consciousness requires a functioning cerebral cortex, the wrinkled outer layer of the brain involved in higher-order processing. Damage to the cortex, particularly widespread damage, can eliminate consciousness even when lower brain structures responsible for basic life functions remain intact. This is the condition of being in a vegetative state. The person's eyes may open, their sleep-wake cycles may continue, they may show reflexive responses, but there's no sign of conscious awareness. The thalamus, a structure deep in the brain that relays sensory information to the cortex, also appears crucial. Damage to specific thalamic regions can cause profound disruptions of consciousness. The brainstem, which controls arousal and wakefulness, is necessary but not sufficient for consciousness. You need to be awake to be conscious, but being awake doesn't guarantee consciousness, as vegetative state patients demonstrate. More specifically, researchers have identified certain patterns of neural activity that correlate with conscious experience. When you become consciously aware of a stimulus, there's typically widespread activation across the cortex, with different brain regions that were processing information locally suddenly becoming synchronized and communicating with each other. This suggests that consciousness might emerge from the integration of information across the brain rather than from activity in any single region. The global workspace theory, proposed by Bernard Baars, formalizes this idea. According to this theory, consciousness is like a theater stage with a spotlight. Information from different brain systems competes for access to this global workspace, and whatever gains access becomes conscious, broadcast to other systems that can then use that information. Most of what your brain does happens in the backstage of unconscious processing. Only a small amount of information reaches the conscious global workspace at any moment. Another influential theory, integrated information theory, or IIT, proposed by Giulio Tononi, takes a more mathematical approach. IIT defines consciousness in terms of integrated information, symbolized by the Greek letter phi. A system is conscious to the extent that it integrates information in a way that can't be reduced to independent parts. Your brain has high phi because neurons are massively interconnected and influence each other in complex ways that can't be decomposed into separate subsystems. A collection of independent computers, even if they're collectively processing the same amount of information, would have lower phi because they're not integrating that information. IIT makes surprising predictions. It suggests that consciousness is a matter of degree rather than all or nothing, that even simple systems might have minimal consciousness if they integrate information, and that certain artificial systems might be conscious even if they don't process information the same way brains do. The theory is controversial, but it's one of the few that attempts to provide a mathematical framework for measuring consciousness. What happens to consciousness when someone is anesthetized provides important clues about its neural basis. General anesthetics don't simply put you to sleep. They fundamentally disrupt consciousness in ways distinct from natural sleep. Under anesthesia, the normal patterns of communication between brain regions break down. Different cortical areas become functionally isolated from each other, unable to integrate information. The result is not just unconsciousness, but often a complete gap in memory, as if that time simply doesn't exist in your personal history. Interestingly, different anesthetics achieve this effect through different molecular mechanisms acting on different neurotransmitter systems, yet they all produce this similar disruption of integrated brain function. This suggests that consciousness depends not on any single neurotransmitter or brain region, but on the pattern of integration and communication across the brain. Split brain patients provide some of the most fascinating evidence about the unity of consciousness. These are people who have had their corpus callosum, the massive bundle of fibers connecting the brain's two hemispheres, surgically severed, usually to prevent the spread of severe epileptic seizures. After the surgery, the two hemispheres can no longer directly communicate, and strange things happen. Because the left hemisphere typically controls language while the right hemisphere is usually mute, split brain patients can verbally report only what their left hemisphere experiences. If you show an image to just their left visual field, which is processed by the right hemisphere, they can't say what they saw. But their left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, can point to a matching image. It's as if there are two separate streams of consciousness in one skull, each with access to different information, each controlling different behaviors. This raises profound questions about the unity of consciousness. Are split brain patients one person with disrupted information flow or two separate consciousnesses sharing a body? Most of the time they function normally, but in carefully controlled experimental situations, the dissociation between hemispheres becomes apparent. This suggests that the unified consciousness we typically experience depends on brain integration that can be disrupted. One of the deepest puzzles in neuroscience is the binding problem. How does the brain create unified conscious experiences from distributed processing? When you see a red ball rolling across the floor, you experience this as a single unified perception, but different aspects of this perception are being processed in different brain regions. Color in one area, motion in another, shape in another, depth in yet another. How are these separate processes bound together into a single conscious experience of a red rolling ball? There must be some mechanism that integrates information from these different regions, but we don't fully understand what that mechanism is or how it produces the subjective unity of consciousness. Moving beyond the human brain, we face the question of how widespread consciousness is in nature. Clearly, humans are conscious. Few would dispute that, except for the most radical eliminativists. Most people also assume that other mammals are conscious, that your dog or cat has subjective experiences, feels pain and pleasure, experiences the world from their own perspective. But as we move further from humans phylogenetically, the question becomes more uncertain and more contentious. Are birds conscious? Most neuroscientists would say yes, particularly for cognitively sophisticated birds like corvids and parrots that demonstrate complex problem-solving and even seem to plan for the future. Octopuses present a fascinating case. They're mollusks, invertebrates whose last common ancestor with vertebrates lived over 500 million years ago. They have neurons, but their nervous system architecture is radically different from ours. Yet they show remarkably complex, flexible behavior. They use tools, solve puzzles, demonstrate individual personalities, can even move across unfamiliar landscapes to reach a goal. Are octopuses conscious? Many researchers now believe they are, suggesting that consciousness has evolved independently multiple times, that it's not restricted to creatures that share our particular neural architecture. But if we grant consciousness to octopuses, where do we draw the line? Are insects conscious? They have tiny brains, just 1 million neurons in a fruit fly, compared to 86 billion in a human. Yet they show surprisingly sophisticated behavior. Bees communicate through dances. Ants organize complex societies. Some insects demonstrate learning and memory. Is there something it's like to be a bee? Some minimal subjective experience of navigating from flower to flower? Or are insects, despite their complex behavior, unconscious automatons? Biological robots running sophisticated programs without any inner experience? We genuinely don't know. And different researchers have different intuitions. Some argue that consciousness requires a certain threshold of neural complexity, and that insects fall below that threshold. Others argue that if a system processes information about its environment and responds flexibly, there's likely some minimal consciousness present. The question becomes even more perplexing with simpler organisms. Are fish conscious? Are worms? Are plants, which respond to their environment, communicate through chemical signals, and demonstrate something like learning? Most researchers draw the line somewhere before plants, arguing that consciousness requires a centralized nervous system and certain types of information processing that plants don't have. But even this is debated. Panpsychism, a philosophical position we'll discuss more later, holds that consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter, present at least in some minimal form in all things. From this perspective, the question isn't whether simpler organisms are conscious, but rather how much consciousness they have and what their experience is like. Self-consciousness, the ability to be aware of yourself as a distinct entity, appears to be rarer than basic consciousness. The mirror test, developed by psychologist Gordon Gallup, is one way researchers have tried to assess self-consciousness in animals. A mark is placed on an animal's body where they can see it only in a mirror. If the animal recognizes that the reflection is themselves and tries to touch or examine the mark on their own body rather than on the mirror, they're considered to have passed the test, demonstrating some form of self-recognition. Great apes, elephants, dolphins, and magpies have passed this test. Many other animals haven't, though this doesn't necessarily mean they lack self-consciousness. They might have self-awareness that doesn't manifest in mirror recognition. A dog primarily experiences the world through smell, not vision, so visual self-recognition might not be a natural form of self-awareness for them. The philosophical debate about consciousness includes a variety of positions, and understanding these different views helps clarify what's at stake and what different thinkers believe consciousness actually is. Let's start with dualism. Historically, the most common view and the position that still matches many people's intuitive sense of things. Dualism, most famously defended by René Descartes in the 17th century, holds that mind and body are fundamentally different kinds of things. The body is physical, extended in space, subject to the laws of physics. The mind is mental, non-physical, not located anywhere in space, the realm of thoughts and feelings and consciousness. For Descartes, the essential self is the thinking mind. The famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The body is something the mind inhabits and controls, but they're distinct substances. Dualism has some initial appeal. It seems to capture the intuition that consciousness is so different from physical matter that it must be something separate. It explains how we can have thoughts about abstract things that don't exist in physical space. It aligns with many religious beliefs about souls that can survive bodily death. But dualism faces severe problems that have led most contemporary philosophers and scientists to reject it. The most famous problem is the interaction problem. If mind and body are truly different kinds of substances, how do they interact? How does your mental decision to raise your arm cause physical events in your brain and muscles? Physical causation we understand. One physical event causes another through the transfer of energy and momentum according to physical laws. But how can a non-physical mind cause physical events? Descartes suggested the pineal gland as the point of interaction, but this just relocates the problem rather than solving it. Moreover, modern neuroscience shows that everything we can observe about consciousness correlates with physical brain states. Damage specific brain regions, and you damage or eliminate specific mental capacities. This tight correlation between mind and brain is hard to explain if they're truly separate substances. Physicalism or materialism is the dominant position in contemporary philosophy and neuroscience. Physicalists hold that everything is physical, that there's only one kind of substance, physical matter and energy, and that consciousness must somehow be a physical phenomenon, even if we don't yet fully understand how. There are different versions of physicalism. Identity theory claims that mental states simply are brain states. To be in pain is to have certain neurons firing in certain patterns. Functionalism, a more sophisticated version, claims that mental states are defined by their functional roles, by what they do, by their causes and effects, rather than by what they're made of. On this view, pain is the state that's typically caused by tissue damage and typically causes avoidance behavior and the urge to cry out, and anything that fills this functional role is pain, whether it's implemented in biological neurons or silicon chips or something else entirely. Physicalism avoids the interaction problem, since if consciousness is physical, it interacts with other physical things through ordinary physical causation. It aligns with the scientific worldview that everything can be explained through physical laws. But physicalism faces the hard problem head-on. How do you get from physical processes to subjective experience? How does the electrochemical activity of neurons produce the feeling of what it's like? Identity theory seems to simply assert that they're the same without explaining how. Functionalism makes consciousness dependent only on abstract functional organization, which seems to leave out the qualitative character of experience. The critic might say, yes, you've explained how the brain processes pain signals and produces pain behaviors, but you haven't explained why this processing feels like something, why there's a subjective experience of pain at all. Illusionism, defended by philosophers like Keith Frankish, takes a radical approach. Consciousness, as we intuitively understand it, with its mysterious subjective qualities, doesn't really exist. What exists is a sophisticated cognitive system that represents itself as having these properties, but the representation is misleading. We think we have irreducible subjective experiences, but this is an illusion created by how our brains model themselves. Pain isn't really a special subjective quality. It's a type of information processing that our brain represents to itself in a way that makes it seem subjectively special. Illusionists argue this dissolves the hard problem. There's nothing to explain beyond the cognitive mechanisms that create the illusion. Critics respond that this seems absurd. The one thing we can be certain of is our own conscious experience. How can consciousness be an illusion when the illusion would itself be a conscious experience? Panpsychism is experiencing a revival among some philosophers frustrated with both dualism and physicalism. Panpsychism holds that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, present, at least in some form, at the most basic level of physical reality. Electrons and quarks have some minimal form of consciousness or proto-consciousness, and complex consciousness like ours emerges when these simple conscious entities are organized in the right ways. This sounds bizarre at first, attributing experience to fundamental particles, but panpsychists argue it's no stranger than attributing consciousness only to certain complex organizations of fundamentally non-conscious matter. If matter is fundamentally non-conscious, how does consciousness ever emerge? Panpsychism avoids this emergence problem by building consciousness into the foundations of reality. Critics point out that panpsychism faces its own combination problem. Even if particles have tiny bits of consciousness, how do these combine to create the unified consciousness we experience? Why does a brain produce one consciousness rather than billions of micro-consciousnesses? Mysterianism, associated with philosopher Colin McGinn, takes the position that consciousness might be permanently inexplicable to human minds. Just as a dog can never understand quantum mechanics because their cognitive architecture doesn't support that kind of understanding, humans might be unable to understand consciousness because our minds have limitations. We can recognize the problem exists, can appreciate its difficulty, but the solution might require concepts or forms of understanding that human brains are simply incapable of grasping. This is intellectually modest but also frustrating. It suggests we might be permanently stuck with a mystery. Some philosophers consider Mysterianism premature defeatism. We haven't exhausted all possible approaches to understanding consciousness. Others find it realistic given the persistent intractability of the hard problem after centuries of thought. As we develop increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence, the question of machine consciousness becomes both philosophically interesting and ethically urgent. Current AI systems, even advanced large language models, are not generally thought to be conscious by their creators or by most researchers. They process information in ways that produce impressive outputs, But there's probably nothing it's like to be ChatGPT. No subjective experience of understanding your questions or formulating responses. But this raises a question. What would it take for an artificial system to be conscious? Could a sufficiently advanced AI become conscious? Or is there something special about biological neural networks that's necessary for consciousness? The Turing test, proposed by Alan Turing in 1950, suggested that if a machine can converse in a way indistinguishable from a human, we should grant that it thinks. But consciousness is not the same as intelligent behavior. A system might process language perfectly, answer any question, behave exactly like a conscious being, yet have no inner experience. This is the philosophical zombie problem applied to AI. We can imagine a computer program that passes every behavioral test for consciousness, yet has no subjective experience, where the lights are off inside. So behavioral tests seem insufficient for consciousness. John Searle's Chinese room argument makes this point vivid. Imagine a person who doesn't understand Chinese sitting in a room with a book of rules for manipulating Chinese symbols. Chinese text is passed into the room. The person follows the rules to produce appropriate Chinese responses, and these responses are passed back out to someone outside. It appears the room understands Chinese. It gives perfect responses to Chinese questions, but neither the person nor the room understands Chinese. They're just following syntactic rules, without any understanding of meaning. Searle argues that computers are like this. They manipulate symbols according to rules, but there's no understanding, no consciousness, just formal symbol manipulation. Critics of Searle point out that while no individual part of the system understands Chinese, perhaps the system as a whole does. That understanding is a property of the entire system rather than of its parts. The question of machine consciousness depends partly on whether consciousness is substrate independent. If consciousness is a matter of functional organization, of the right kind of information processing, then it doesn't matter whether it's implemented in biological neurons or silicon transistors or anything else. A computer running the right program would be just as conscious as a brain. But if there's something special about biological neurons, some physical property they have that's necessary for consciousness, then artificial systems with different physical implementations might never be conscious, no matter how sophisticated their processing. We genuinely don't know which of these is correct. Integrated information theory suggests consciousness depends on how information is integrated, not on what substrate does the integrating, which would allow for artificial consciousness. But other theories are more skeptical. The ethical implications are profound. If we create artificial systems that are conscious, they would have moral status. It would be wrong to cause them suffering, wrong to delete them if that constitutes death, wrong to treat them as mere tools. But how would we know whether an AI system is conscious? We can't directly access its subjective experience any more than we can access a bat's or another person's. We'd have to rely on behavior, on structural analogies, on our theories about what produces consciousness. But what if we're wrong? What if we create suffering beings without realizing it? Or conversely, what if we wrongly attribute consciousness to sophisticated but non-conscious systems and constrain our use of powerful technologies based on a mistake? These questions are becoming urgent as AI capabilities advance. Some researchers are already thinking about consciousness tests for AI, trying to develop behavioral and functional criteria that would provide evidence for or against machine consciousness. But given our limited understanding of consciousness, even in biological systems, this is extraordinarily difficult terrain. Exploring altered states of consciousness provides important insights into its structure and nature. Psychedelic substances like psilocybin, LSD, and DMT profoundly alter consciousness in ways that users often describe as among the most meaningful experiences of their lives. Under psychedelics, the normal boundaries of self can dissolve, leading to experiences of unity with the universe or with all existence. Visual perception changes dramatically, with patterns and colors taking on intense significance. Time perception warps. The usual filtering and organizing that consciousness does can break down, leading to overwhelming sensory input. Neuroscience studies show that psychedelics disrupt the brain's default mode network, a set of regions active during rest and self-referential thinking. When this network's activity decreases, the rigid patterns that normally structure consciousness loosen, allowing for more fluid, less constrained experiences. What do psychedelic experiences tell us about consciousness? They demonstrate that the normal structure of consciousness, the sense of a unified self experiencing a stable world, is somewhat arbitrary, a particular configuration that the brain constructs, but that can be radically reconfigured. They suggest that consciousness is more flexible and varied than we typically realize. Some people report psychedelic experiences of encountering what feel like alien forms of consciousness, entities or presences that seem conscious but utterly different from human consciousness. Whether these are genuine encounters with other consciousness, hallucinations created by the altered brain, or something else entirely is debated. But they stretch our conception of what consciousness might be like beyond the human norm. Meditation, particularly advanced practices in Buddhist and Hindu traditions, also produces altered states that illuminate consciousness. Experienced meditators report states of pure awareness without content, consciousness that's not directed at anything but simply aware of being aware. They describe experiences of non-dual awareness where the usual subject-object distinction dissolves, where there's no longer an I observing an external world but just awareness itself. Neuroscience studies of meditators show changes in brain activity and structure, particularly in areas involved in self-referential processing and attention control. Some meditators report that these experiences reveal consciousness not as something produced by the brain, but as something fundamental, with the brain serving more as a filter or receiver than as the generator of consciousness. This interpretation is controversial, but the experiences themselves are well documented and suggest that ordinary waking consciousness is just one mode among many possible modes of awareness. Near-death experiences present another intriguing altered state. People who have come close to death, often during cardiac arrest, sometimes report vivid experiences, leaving their body, moving through a tunnel toward light, encountering deceased loved ones or religious figures, experiencing overwhelming peace and love, reviewing their entire life. These experiences are remarkably similar across cultures, suggesting they're not just cultural constructions. Skeptics explain them as hallucinations produced by an oxygen-deprived or dying brain. But some aspects are harder to explain away. Cases where people report accurate perceptions of events during the period when they had no heartbeat or brain activity, suggesting consciousness continued even when the brain wasn't functioning normally. These cases are rare and controversial, with alternative explanations offered, but they raise the question of what relationship consciousness has to brain function. If consciousness can continue when the brain is compromised, This might suggest it's not simply identical to brain activity. Synesthesia, a condition where senses blend together, provides insight into how consciousness constructs experience. Synesthetes might see colors when they hear music, taste flavors when they read words, or experience numbers as having intrinsic colors. These cross-sensory experiences are automatic and consistent for each individual. Synesthesia shows us that the way consciousness organizes sensory information is somewhat arbitrary. Most people experience vision and hearing as completely separate, but the brain could connect them differently, and for synesthetes it does. This suggests that the structure of conscious experience is constructed by the brain, rather than being a simple reflection of external reality. The same physical stimuli, sound waves, create different experiences in different brains, depending on how those brains are wired. Blind sight is perhaps the most philosophically interesting altered state because it involves consciousness being absent where we'd expect it to be present. Blind sight occurs in people with damage to the primary visual cortex, the brain region essential for conscious vision. These patients report being completely blind in part of their visual field. They experience darkness, no visual awareness at all. But remarkably, if you ask them to guess about objects in their blind field, they guess correctly at rates far above chance. They can reach for objects they can't see, navigate around obstacles they're not aware of, even discriminate emotional expressions on faces they claim not to see. Visual information is reaching their brain and influencing their behavior. But it's not reaching consciousness. They're processing visual information without being consciously aware of seeing. Blind sight demonstrates a clear dissociation between information processing and conscious awareness, suggesting that consciousness is not simply information being processed, but requires that information to reach certain brain systems. It also raises questions about what consciousness adds. If a person can successfully navigate using visual information without being aware of seeing, what function does visual consciousness serve? Why aren't we all blind-sighted, processing visual information and acting on it without any subjective experience? This connects to the hard problem. If we can explain all the functional roles that vision serves in behavior without invoking consciousness, why does conscious visual experience exist at all? Blind sight doesn't answer this, but it makes the question especially stark by showing that sophisticated visual processing can occur without consciousness. As we approach the end of this long exploration, what can we conclude about consciousness? The honest answer is that after centuries of philosophical inquiry and decades of intensive neuroscience research, we still don't really know what consciousness is or how it arises from physical processes. We've learned a great deal about the neural correlates of consciousness, about which brain regions and processes are associated with conscious experience. We've developed sophisticated theories about the functional role of consciousness and the information processing that underlies it. We've explored the varieties of conscious experience through altered states and clinical conditions. We've clarified the philosophical problems and mapped out the space of possible answers. But the core mystery remains. We haven't solved the hard problem of explaining why there's something it's like to be a conscious creature, why subjective experience exists at all. Some researchers are optimistic that we're on the cusp of major breakthroughs, that advancing neuroscience and more sophisticated theories will soon crack the consciousness problem. They point to progress in identifying neural correlates, to theories like integrated information theory that attempt mathematical formulations to our increasing ability to manipulate consciousness through interventions. Others are more skeptical, worrying that we're not even asking the right questions yet, that the conceptual frameworks we're using are inadequate for the phenomenon we're trying to explain. Mysterians think the problem might be permanently beyond human understanding, and some, particularly in contemplative traditions, suggest that the problem looks intractable because we're approaching it wrong, trying to understand consciousness as an object of study when it's actually the subject doing the studying, that a different mode of investigation, through direct introspection and meditation, might provide insights that third-person science cannot. One thing that's become clear is that consciousness is probably not all or nothing but admits of degrees and varieties. There's likely a continuum from minimal consciousness, whatever that might be like in simple organisms, through richer forms in mammals and birds, to the particularly elaborate self-conscious awareness humans possess, and potentially to forms of consciousness we can barely imagine in beings with very different cognitive architecture. The question, is this system conscious, might not have a simple yes or no answer, but rather require specifying what kind and degree of consciousness we're asking about. A dog is conscious in some ways but not others. An infant has consciousness, but not the same reflective self-consciousness as an adult. Different aspects of consciousness, phenomenal experience, access consciousness, self-consciousness, might come apart in various ways in different systems. The mystery of consciousness has profound ethical implications. If other beings are conscious, if there's something it's like to be them, then their experiences matter morally. The suffering of conscious beings should concern us. This extends the moral circle beyond just humans to include animals, at least those we have good reason to believe are conscious. It potentially extends to future artificial systems if we create conscious AI, and it makes questions about consciousness experimentally and philosophically urgent, not just as abstract puzzles but as issues with real moral stakes. How we treat animals in factory farms, whether we're causing suffering that matters morally, depends partly on whether those animals are conscious and what their experience is like, whether it would be ethical to create conscious AI systems that might suffer, or whether we'd have moral obligations to AI beings we create, depends on whether they would actually be conscious. The mystery also has implications for how we understand ourselves. The human sense of being a unified self, a single conscious agent experiencing the world and making choices, might be somewhat illusory. The brain is made up of many specialized systems that process information in parallel, and consciousness might be more fragmented and constructed than it feels from the inside. The split brain cases suggest that the unity of consciousness depends on brain connectivity that can be disrupted. Research on unconscious processing shows that much of what guides our behavior happens outside conscious awareness. The self might be more like a story the brain tells, a narrative that creates coherence out of disparate processes, than like a fundamental entity. This doesn't mean the self doesn't exist, but it might exist in a different way than we intuitively suppose, as a useful fiction or an emergent pattern rather than as a simple ontological fact. There's also a kind of existential wonder to the mystery of consciousness. Each of us is a universe of experience, a subjective world that's inaccessible to anyone else. Right now, billions of these experiential universes exist, each person carrying their own private world of sensations, thoughts, and feelings. When someone dies, an entire universe of experience vanishes. When someone is born, a new experiential universe comes into being. We're each in the extraordinary position of being simultaneously a physical object, a body made of ordinary matter following physical laws, and a subject, a locus of experience and awareness for whom the universe appears in a particular way. This dual nature, being both object and subject, is perhaps the deepest mystery of existence. Every other object we know about seems to be just an object, describable entirely from the outside. But we're different. We're objects that are also subjects, matter that experiences, physical stuff that has an inner life. Some philosophers and physicists have suggested that consciousness might be as fundamental to the universe as mass or charge, a basic feature of reality rather than something that emerges only in complex systems like brains. In this view, the question isn't how consciousness arises from non-conscious matter, but rather how the elementary consciousness that's always present becomes organized and amplified in systems like brains to produce the rich conscious experience we have. This is speculative, and most scientists remain skeptical, but it reflects the profound difficulty of explaining consciousness in conventional terms. If consciousness seems impossible to explain as emerging from non-conscious physical processes, perhaps that's because it doesn't emerge, because it was there all along in some form. There's a beautiful idea from various mystical and philosophical traditions that consciousness is how the universe knows itself, that we're the universe becoming aware of its own existence. The atoms in your body were forged in stars billions of years ago, scattered across space when those stars exploded, eventually coalescing into planets and then into life, and then into you. Those atoms, through a process we don't fully understand, have become arranged in such a way that they're aware, that they experience, that they ponder their own existence. In you, the universe looks at itself with wonder. This might sound like poetic language, but it's also literally true. Consciousness, whatever it is, represents matter, becoming aware of matter, the universe developing the capacity for self-reflection. That's extraordinary. Regardless of how we ultimately explain the mechanism, perhaps the mystery of consciousness will never be fully solved. Perhaps there's something inherently inexplicable about subjective experience, some aspect that resists objective analysis because it's irreducibly subjective. Or perhaps tomorrow someone will have an insight that cracks the problem wide open, showing us how experience emerges from information processing in a way that suddenly makes perfect sense. We don't know which of these futures awaits us. What we do know is that we're conscious, that this fact is undeniable, even when everything else might be doubted, and that consciousness is the most intimate and immediate thing in our existence, even as it remains the most puzzling. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of consciousness, this journey into the deepest mystery of existence. We've examined it from philosophical, neuroscientific, and contemplative perspectives. We've looked at thought experiments and clinical cases, at theories and speculations. We've confronted the hard problem and explored the varieties of conscious experience. We've asked whether machines could be conscious and what consciousness might be like for bats and octopuses. We've seen how altered states stretch the boundaries of normal consciousness and reveal its constructed nature. If this has deepened your sense of wonder about your own consciousness, about the extraordinary fact of your own awareness, then the journey has been worthwhile. If you found value in this exploration, consider subscribing for more investigations into the deep questions of philosophy, science, and human existence. But for now, let these thoughts settle. There's a beautiful irony in the fact that you've been contemplating consciousness for all this time, and now you're about to lose it, to drift into sleep where consciousness either disappears entirely or transforms into the strange alternative reality of dreams. Sleep is itself a mystery, a state where consciousness recedes or changes in ways we don't fully understand. But unlike the mystery of consciousness itself, which might never be solved, the mystery of why you're tired has a simple answer. You're tired because you're human, and humans need rest. You don't need to understand consciousness to let it go for a while. You don't need to solve the hard problem before allowing yourself to sleep. The question of what consciousness is, the question of what you are when you're aware and what happens when that awareness fades, these questions can wait until morning. Right now, the most important thing is not understanding consciousness, but allowing it to do what it naturally does in the cycle of day and night, to recede, to quiet, to let the brain rest and restore itself. Whatever consciousness is, whatever mysterious relationship holds between the physical neurons in your brain and the subjective experience of being you, that relationship will still be there tomorrow. The hard problem will remain unsolved. The philosophical debates will continue. The neuroscience will advance incrementally. But none of that needs your attention right now. Right now, you can simply be conscious without analyzing what that means. And then, gradually, gently, you can let even that go as sleep arrives. Rest well, mysterious, conscious being. Let the universe's awareness of itself through you fade into the background. Good night.